In our final part of World War I, we'll look at the treaty that ended the war, focusing on what Woodrow Wilson attempted to achieve and what the actual outcomes were. So all those really terrible things happened in a pretty short period of time that we were a part of the war. And so when we come limping back, Americans are not overly excited to be a part of the world. They're thinking, maybe George Washington had a good point. But Woodrow Wilson still believes that being a part of the world and arbitrating for prevention are the best things that he could do. That's why we were a part of the war. We bled on the battlefield. Now we get to be part of the peacemaking decisions. So the peace occurs in Paris. So this is the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, which ends World War I. And we have the big four victors here in order from left to right. We have, that's David Lloyd George. He is the Prime Minister of England. Next to him is Vittorio Orlando. He is the Prime Minister of Italy, which is a kingdom at this point, so there's a king in Italy. And then we have Georges Clemenceau of France. And then next to that is the American Woodrow Wilson. Now years before Woodrow Wilson arrives in Paris in 1919, he'd already been considering if he joins this war and if he gets to help arbitrate the end of this war, what would he do? What would he say? So in January 1917, he makes a speech to Congress as part of his State of the Union address. And in this speech, he gives us his hope for a peace without victory, which becomes his famous phrase. Basically, he's saying that, because we're not a part of this war yet, remember. By January 1917, it's clear that we might be a part of this war. Remember, at the end of this month, Germany will resume unrestricted submarine warfare, and by February we will break diplomatic relations, and by March we will publish the Zimmermann Telegraph. So in the next few months things are moving quickly, and Wilson's aware of that. So in 1917 he makes this speech to Congress where he's saying, look, whoever wins this war, I hope it's the British, right? He doesn't say that, but whoever wins this war, I hope that they will treat the loser reasonably, that they'll be fair. They'll create a fair and just peace. What he's basically asking for is for the winner of the war not to overly punish the loser, right? Don't beat them in war, and then dance on their grave. Don't rub it in their faces, right? Instead, he argues that the best thing you can do, right, to ensure sort of this lasting, beautiful peace, and we'll see lots of political cartoons with Wilson and the dove, is to kind of let bygones be bygones, and rather than destroy your enemy at the end of the war, resurrect them, build them up. He argued that only a peace amongst equals can last. If you destroy your enemy, it will only create resentment, and that could potentially, lead to a short-term peace, but an eventual war again. So to prevent that eventual war, don't destroy the loser. All right, so this is his first idea that he takes with him to Paris: peace without victory. 1 year later, in January 1918, January is not like his thinking month. He's making another State of the Union address. He makes another speech to Congress, and here he presents another idea. By this time, we are a part of the war. He says that when this war comes to an end, we need to consider all the reasons why it started. And, maybe things like secret treaties, like what exists between Serbia and Russia, maybe things like targeting neutral nations, like what England and Germany did. Maybe things like having naval arms races, like Germany and Britain did. Maybe those things, creating colonial nations, like what happened to Bosnia and Herzegovina, maybe those things lead us into war. So he recommended a series of international norms or laws, which he called the 14 points because there were 14 of them. And he reads these off to Congress in January 1918. And I'm not giving them all to you here. Some of them are actually quite specific depending on the actual nation. Like he actually recommends that Poland become a nation because Poland just has a rough history of getting ruined on either side. He recommends that some French territory be restored. He recommends autonomous development in Austria and Hungary. He recommends evacuations of occupied territory. So he gets into specifics, but the big general ones he provided included things like this: open diplomacy. Again, maybe secret treaties, not a great idea. Maybe if the European powers had paused for just a hot minute and talked, attempted diplomacy rather than just falling over each other to rush into war, right? Like that domino effect we saw. Maybe if we had open diplomacy and the willingness to talk to one another, that could prevent war. He says maybe we should have freedom of navigation of the seas. Right, this whole idea of you're in my sea, this is my sea, I'm going to create a war zone, I'm going to mine the North Sea, which the English did, which I don't even think I mentioned. Like, that's not cool. Those things lead to war. How about an arms reduction? If everybody's walking around jacked up like Rambo, chances are someone's going to get shot. So chill out, put your weapons down. Let's all reduce our arms. Removal of trade barriers, right? The whole neutral trading issue with the U.S. And then he said something that stressed out a lot of people: national self-determination, which basically means he thinks that nations should, oh my gosh, rule themselves, right? That's a crazy thing to suggest in an era where 80% of the globe are ran by like 5 or 6 nations. And the British and the French in particular were like, say what? Right? We want national self-determination for ourselves, but not for India, not for Africa, right? And so forth and so on. So he suggested really progressive, really liberal, really nice things, right? And so immediately there's this idea of Wilson as a potential world leader, right? Can he get the rest of the world to, play in tune with him, get the nations to produce this beautiful harmony of world peace? But even his own advisors told him, dude, especially the last one, national self-determination, they told him, not only are you increasing hopes around the world, like people in India and Africa are going to be like, oh my gosh, maybe I should have a revolution and be a new nation. He's like, you're just encouraging revolutions to start around the world. But in addition, if you're saying things like people around the world should be free, well, I don't know if you're aware, Mr. President, but people in this nation aren't free. Like his advisors told him this. They're like, you're going to see revolts against racial minorities in this nation, for the same reason we saw the whole women's suffrage thing, right? If you think that people should be treated equally abroad, then of course they're going to demand it here. And the chances of them securing that anytime soon is very low. So he was told, you have raised hope, which could never be realized. So we do see Woodrow Wilson as being sort of way ahead of his time. Now, when I was in grad school, Woodrow Wilson was like the man. Like, I put him up on a pedestal until I found out he was wildly racist, which we'll learn about in the 1920s. So then Wilson says, how are we going to enforce the 14 points? Well, we'll create an international body, a League of Nations, which will be ran by member nations, and of those member nations, there will be an executive board. And that executive board will be ran by the victors of World War I. Not Russia, they're out, but it would include the US, the British, the French. Remember, the Italians jumped ship with the secret Treaty of London, and we threw Japan a bone. Japan does get stuff in this war. They get some Micronesian nations from Germany. They also get a Chinese port that Germany had previously occupied. So the Japanese get some stuff. So that's sort of the idea, right? That these 5 nations would be kind of the Security Council, just like the UN today. And there could be other members as well. And at its height, the League of Nations had something like 50 members. But originally it was an additional, I think only 4 outside of this. Woodrow Wilson believes a lot in the League of Nations. He believes that it is sort of his olive branch to the world to create peace. He believes that only the League of Nations could chain the dog of war. He believed in it very, very strongly. Right? If we all commit to these ideas, we'll have this international governing body to enforce those 14 points. He was very much ahead of his time in a lot of ways. Well, then he takes those ideas to Paris, and every losing nation got their own peace treaty, right? So the Ottomans got their own peace treaty. Austria and Hungary are split up, so now Austria becomes a separate nation. They got a peace treaty. Hungary became a separate nation. They got a peace treaty. So Bulgaria got a peace treaty. They were part of the Central Powers as well, and so forth and so on. And the Germans got their own peace treaty. The peace treaty specifically written for the Germans was written and signed within the Hall of Mirrors in the Versailles Palace outside Paris. So this is known as the Versailles Treaty. So it was specifically the treaty just for Germany. Now the other nations were kind of brutalized as well. They had to pay heavy reparations. They had to lower their weapons. They lost some territory. So the other nations were not treated kindly either. But the Versailles Treaty is the most famous because it was particularly brutal to Germany and, of course, leads to resentment that leads to the rise of the Nazis. Now, Woodrow Wilson, which you see in the back end of that spoon there, is not overly excited to brutally punish Germany because this is the opposite of peace without victory, like forcing these terrible peace terms down the throats of the Germans. So the Versailles Treaty is actually pretty long and has all these sort of details, but very basically it heavily punishes Germany in multiple ways. First, it forces Germany to pay war reparations. And the initial number given to Germany was something around $33 billion, which was like laughable because Germany was simply unable in any realistic way to pay that much money. They were completely devastated by the war. And even the Europeans, the British and the French were like, yeah, they're not going to be able to pay this. It was almost like an FU number. FU, pay me. And eventually that number is lowered twice, but not by too much. So that was the first one. They had to pay a ton of war reparations, like pay for the war. Again, war reparations were so heavy that they'll continue to hurt the German economy to the point where they just physically cannot pay them. And part of the reason for that is not only are they impoverished because of the war, but they also lose stuff because of the war. So the Versailles Treaty also took territory away. You'll notice they actually lost that territory they took from Russia, and we'll see the creation of Poland created. They took territory from Germany, Austria, and Hungary, and they're like, what should we do with it? I don't know, let's make it a nation. So the nation of Czechoslovakia is born. And then to the left there, you see a light green area called the Rhineland. This is still part of Germany, but it had to remain demilitarized. So absolutely no military could be in the Rhineland, which of course borders Luxembourg and Belgium and France. Like those nations are freaking sick of the Germans invading. So they wanted this military buffer zone. The Germans are also going to have a hard time paying off any kind of reparations because their economy was based around the military, and part of the Versailles Treaty said complete demilitarization. Even new industry could not go towards the military. So they had to, as you can see, physically break down what they had. Not only does this, of course, a moral loss because the whole country sort of built around it, but it's a significant economic loss. The military created so many jobs, and now those are gone. How are they going to possibly pay off these war reparations? But in addition to demilitarization, intense reparations, loss of land, the biggest thing that is remembered in the Versailles Treaty, which the other Central Powers did not have, was war guilt. So there is this clause within the Versailles Treaty, which the Germans had to sign on to, which says that the Germans are responsible for starting the war. Now, the war guilt clause alone didn't make Germany lose anything tangibly. It just made it lose pride. They're now the bad guy in history books. So, of course, while we're here at Paris, all the Central Powers are doing this game of whodunit, like pointing at everyone else, being like, well, technically Serbia invaded. Yeah, but it was the Balls. Yeah, but Austria declared war for... Everybody's trying to blame everyone else. And the Allies just call out the Germans because of the original blank check. They tell the Germans, you gave Austria a blank check. If you had not done that, there would have just been a war between Austria and Serbia, and the rest of us wouldn't have gotten involved. So Germany is blamed, right? And Hitler and the Nazis are particularly upset with the war guilt clause, which they felt was sort of unnecessarily cruel. And Wilson himself protested the war guilt clause. He's like, war guilt? Are you kidding me? This is the opposite of peace without victory. So obviously the League of Nations is not really in jive with Wilson's hopes for peace without victory. And yet he signs the Versailles Treaty as a representative of the United States. It still has to pass the Senate. He goes and pressures senators to ratify it. He even goes on a tour of the U.S., encouraging Americans to put pressure on their senators so that we can pass the Versailles Treaty. Why would he go through all that? Why would he push so hard to get ratification of a treaty that he knows is wrong? Because it violates his hopes for peace without victory. The reason is because the other allies were quite clever. They hate peace without victory. They want to see Germany punished. They also need Wilson on board. So they appease Wilson by giving him the League of Nations. They're like, you're really into this league, which is supposed to enforce your 14 points. That's very nice. But they add the League of Nations to the Versailles Treaty. And in fact, the League of Nations, or the creation of a League of Nations, is in Article 10 of the Versailles Treaty. Thus, if he signs the Versailles Treaty, he gets the League of Nations, but he doesn't get peace without victory. If he refuses to sign the Versailles Treaty and support his hopes of peace without victory, well, now the Allies might pull back on a League of Nations, and now he might not get that. So he really had to choose, of the two goals that he brings to Paris, peace without victory and the League of Nations to enforce the 14 points, which one is more important? And he had to do a little soul searching here for a hot minute. Which one of these two ideas is more likely to ensure long-lasting peace? Because he can't have one or the other. Again, because the Allies attach the League of Nations to the Versailles Treaty. Right? If you want the League of Nations, you're going to have to punish Germany. If you don't punish Germany, you don't get the League of Nations. So he thinks back and forth, and he eventually decides that of the two, the League of Nations is the most important. And so he signs the Versailles Treaty and puts a lot of pressure back home on senators and the American population to support ratification of the Versailles Treaty. And so he's going to leave peace without victory in the dust. And so Germany will be heavily punished under the Versailles Treaty. What Wilson thinks is that even though Germany is going to be very heavily punished, the League of Nations will still help to prevent a future war. Some other things to consider as we move forward into world history is World War I changed the map a lot. Again, we have some new nations here. Hello, Poland. Hello, Czech. Poland's always been around. It's just had a rough time. But now, Wilson's like, this is jacked up. Poland's had a rough history. Freaking leave it alone. So Poland becomes a nation. Czechoslovakia becomes a thing. That territory that the Russians lost, they're like, don't give it to Russia, but don't give it to Germany. So we see new nations of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania being created there as well. and a lot of other things there. You can see, ironically, the Black Hand got what it wanted. Yugoslavia is created, and it lasts until the 1990s. So the map is starting to change. But there's a couple countries we should focus on, since of course we are headed for World War II. Now in World War II, we're going to be fighting the Axis powers, and the Axis powers are made up of Germany, Italy, and Japan. And all three of them are pissed at the end of World War I. All three of them did not get what they wanted, and they're angry, and that leads their governments to do things which takes them closer towards signing the Axis Accords. So Germany Germany got destroyed with the Versailles Treaty. They're pissed. But what about Italy and Japan? Because they were actually part of the Allies. Well, first Japan. Japan really only joined the war to get German scraps, which it did. It's happy, basically. It's also a kind of executive member within the League of Nations. It's on that Security Council. And as a member of that elite council, Japan walks into the first meeting, looks around the room, and immediately notices that this is a room full of white men. And they get a little concerned, and they're like, ugh, this isn't like a white man's club, is it? Like, you understand that the Japanese are also like, a pretty cool race too. So they request that the League of Nations, as part of their mission statement, create what they call the Racial Equality Clause, which would basically suggest that the League of Nations believes all races, or at least some races to include the Japanese, to be equal. And just like the UN Security Council today, every member on the League of Nations Council has veto power. Woodrow Wilson originally, we'll see we're not actually in the League, but Woodrow Wilson kind of sort of supported the idea. But it was actually the British that veto it. The British veto the Racial Equality Clause. They're like, dude, I can't sign on to something that says racial equality. I own a third of Africa and India. And I'm not very nice to these people. I can't possibly sign on to it. It would cause all sorts of problems within my kingdom. So that pisses off Japan, right? They thought this is actually a French poster making fun of the supposed friendship between the British and the Japanese, which we realize is not very friendly at all when the British veto the Racial Equality Clause. The Japanese are pissed. They're offended, right? Remember how offended they were during the whole San Francisco segregation thing? It even made freaking Theodore Roosevelt nervous. The Japanese are pissed. They eventually leave the League of Nations and realize that these European nations that were their supposed friends in World War I, they are not their friends. So they begin to say, screw them. I'm going to focus on me. I'm going to take care of me. And so they begin a process there in Asia of demonstrating their, superiority and their survivability by expanding into Asia. So we'll meet up with the Japanese then. What about the Italians? The Italians jumped ship in 1915. Well, remember, as part of the Secret Treaty of London, the Italians, if they joined the Allies, were supposed to get territory around the Adriatic Sea. Well, Woodrow Wilson enters the stage with all of his, lovely ideas for world peace. And he's like, are you freaking kidding me? This war started because people were trying to take territory from the Balkans. And now you want to take some of that territory and give it to Italy just so it can control the Adriatic Sea? Plus, this is kind of important land, right? Coastal property there. So the Allies agree, and Italy is never given the land it was promised on the other side of the Adriatic Sea, dramatically slowing its goal to eventually become, another sort of Roman Empire. So Italy is pissed, and kind of like the Japanese, they're like, I guess you're not my friends. And they decide to start going about their own way to recreate the Roman Empire. And so we'll see some young, angry, radical political groups in Italy begin to rise up, most notably the fascists. So fascism is actually from the Italian word fascismo. So fascism was actually invented as a political movement in Italy. The Germans are just famous for it. And finally, since we will be looking more later at our relations with the Middle East, something else that comes out of World War I, which is less related to the U.S., is the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So during the war, which of course broke out in the East as well, as a way to get support to fight against the Ottomans, because the British were originally, losing to the Ottoman Empire, they wanted to rally support from the Levant territory, right? This territory in the Middle East that makes up modern-day Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and so forth. So they sent British officers there, most notably and very famously, this guy, Lawrence of Arabia, right? So T.E. Lawrence was sent by, he was actually an archaeologist, so he knew the territory well, and he becomes an officer during the war. And they send him into the Levant territory to negotiate, most notably with King Faisal of Jordan, to combine all of the clans of the area and fight with the British against the Ottomans. And if they do that, the British government will help to ensure their sovereignty after the war. Like, basically, we're not going to touch you like we're touching the rest of the world. Well, T.E. Lawrence, Colonel T.E. Lawrence, or Lawrence of Arabia as he's famously known, probably thought that was what was going to happen. But behind closed doors, the French and the British and the Russians actually had no interest at all in eventually giving this independence and sovereignty to the Levant nations, and instead secretly made plans to divide up the territory between the three. Well, the Russians aren't involved very long because the Russian Revolution occurs. And when the Bolsheviks take over, they actually find these secret papers and publish it for the world. And the British and French acknowledge it. They're like, yes, that's right. We were secretly planning to take over the Levant. Honestly, though, we're the British and the French. I'm not sure why everyone's surprised. And so with the Russians out, the French and the British divided up the Levant into areas of control and influence, which you can see in this orange and green map, with the British either directly controlling or influencing southern regions and the French to the north. So what was happening in Africa is now getting to happen in the Levant territory. Now, the territory that will become Israel was organized as an international zone, though it was largely overseen by the British. So this is the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement of how the British and the French secretly divided up this territory. And it creates for us some very long-term anti-Western resentment within the region. And it also sets us up for eventually the U.S. recognition of Israel at the end of World War II, which we will get to as well. You really can't even begin to discuss Western-Arab relations without at least mentioning the Sykes-Picot Agreement. It's really instrumental in even sort of modern-day relations. And there you go. The the Russians found this after their revolution and published it to the world. Back home, Wilson had signed the Versailles Treaty, but under the U.S. Constitution, just because the president signed something doesn't make it legal. The Senate is in charge of foreign affairs and in charge of foreign treaties, so they have to ratify it. So Wilson goes back to the Senate and he's like, you guys should totally sign the Versailles Treaty. It punishes Germany, which is bad, but it includes the League of Nations, and the League of Nations will save the world. Now, the senators read this, and frankly, they're like, I don't really give a shit about punishing the Germans. I don't care. But I have a problem with the League of Nations. And Woodrow Wilson's like, that's the part you have a problem with? That's the only good part in it. And if you see this picture at the top here, like, Wilson just couldn't understand why the Senate was so afraid of the League of Nations. He's like, what are you freaking out about? This is a thing that's going to create peace. So the problem for the senators at this point was, by the time Wilson gets home, again, all those things we discussed, the emotional ramifications of the war were very prevalent on the U.S. And the senators have to consider their constituents when they vote. The League of Nations, senators feared, would immediately tie the U.S. to all these world events. And rather than isolate us from the world, which we were kind of hoping for, to at least militarily and politically retreat from the world, we would be even more involved in the world. So Wilson believes in the League. He hops on a train. By now, of course, since 1913, we have the 17th Amendment, which means that senators are directly elected. So he goes out and talks to the people, hoping they'll put pressure on their senators to sign the Versailles Treaty, thus allowing U.S. to be a part of the League of Nations. He goes on this tour. He's speaking all over the country. Being president is hard. It's very hard on your body, and that's evident in this case. While traveling through Colorado, I believe, he collapses in September with a stroke. And he becomes permanently paralyzed on half of his body and basically incapacitated in many cases, can't speak or anything. The vote was held in November, and it fell just 7 votes short of being passed. This tells historians, based on how close the vote was in the Senate, that if Wilson did not have a stroke and was able to continue his campaign tour, he might have gotten enough pressure on the Senate to get ratification of the Versailles Treaty and thus U.S. being a member to the League of Nations. But that's not what happened. He had a stroke, he could not complete the tour, and it fell 7 votes short. Which means, as far as the U.S. is concerned, World War I is still legally on, right, until all parties sign the peace treaty. There's a drunk history if you're interested. But basically what happens is in this lower image here, you see this picture of Edith Wilson, Woodrow Wilson's wife, basically holding him up. So he has a stroke, and because of that, he doesn't really make it public, and he just kind of stays in kind of the shadows. And his wife began to run a lot of this paperwork for him, like run messages for him. And people thought that was weird because the president's always out and about and always making these big romantic speeches. And so people, Republicans in particular, who are kind of after Woodrow Wilson, start criticizing that, oh, what's wrong with him? Something's going on. And they try to do like an investigation. And so Edith Wilson's trying to cover up the fact that her husband's like had a freaking stroke. So she just pretends like, no, he's fine. He's just tired, but don't worry. I'm giving you these papers. And it's been suggested that she probably may have forged his signature. He couldn't really read or respond to the papers he was being given, so that she kind of, this is theory, that she just kind of started to make decisions, like all these bills that that he would get from Congress and he's required to sign within 10 days. She just started signing or not signing them, forging his signature. So some people have argued that Edith Wilson is the first female president of the United States. And even the press starts to be like, where's Wilson? Where's Wilson? So she held a press conference. This is a day and age where you can control the press. Like, there's no way Trump could have a stroke and be paralyzed and we wouldn't know today. First of all, Twitter would shut down. So that would be our first clue. But this was a day and age where you could still control the press. So she invites some members of the press to come in, take his picture very quickly. She poses him, is holding him from the back, has him just kind of sit up holding a pencil, as you can see, to make it so they could quickly snap a photo that he is working. And this was the photo that was then circulated around. So everyone's like, the president's good, he's fine. This eventually leads to momentum for what becomes the 25th Amendment, that basically says if a president is in any way mentally or physically unable to fulfill his duties, if he's incapacitated in any way, he has to step down so that the vice president can step in, even if it's just temporarily. Because remember, when Garfield was assassinated, when he was shot, it took him months to die, but he was still technically our commander-in-chief during that period of time. So now we have an amendment that protects against that. So this is how we sort of question Wilson. Is he kind of what we're seeing here on the left? He had this wonderful idea that could create world peace. Was he ahead of his time? Or was he a bit of a buffoon? Was he kind of a child, an idealist, a pageant queen, which is how sort of the Europeans saw him, right? This is sort of the debate about Wilson. How should we view him? But we have to remember how the Senate is feeling, right? This is actually a British cartoon, but this idea that so many people are coming home wounded and injured, not only does that affect them, just in the physicality of their daily lives and their, psychological state, but it also impeded their ability to get a job, right? So you see a lot of veterans, which is crazy, unable to get reasonable employment because they've lost a limb or something, especially if they used to work in a factory. And that was just a huge shame that follows World War I. So there's, again, this concern. So I'm just showing you lots of images to try and make this make sense for you. That the concern was that if we're in the League of Nations, we're just going to continue to see more of what we've seen. Injured boys coming home, dead boys coming home so they can run off and help John Bull up there in the corner. Hi, Sam, send me over a new army, right? That was a genuine concern at the time. At the same time, while we're sending our boys abroad, we're opening those doors for these anarchists to start coming in. We don't have a strong enough filter in terms of immigration laws, so all these, idiots, beggars, and prostitutes are entering the country. We need a finer screen. So World War I left us wanting to militarily isolate ourselves from the world, not economically, but militarily isolate ourselves from the world, while also at the same time close our doors to immigrants. So the 1920s becomes a period both of military isolation as well as anti-immigration. The reason the Senate refuses to ratify the League of Nations has really nothing to do with the punishment of Germany. In fact, it has nothing to do with the League of Nations. It's solely because Article 10, it's an X there, but that's because I can't do a Roman numeral on my computer, but Article 10 in Roman numerals on the League of Nations includes the U.S. The only problem they had with the entire treaty was two words: United States. That the United States would be a part of the League of Nations. And a group of Republican senators, known as the Irreconcilables, simply refused to budge, right? Because again, they view what you're seeing here, the League of Nations, is sort of tying us up as a nice little treat to get, tangled up in international strife. So they vote on it again in 1920, and again the Senate refused to ratify it. Finally, it goes back to the Senate in 1921, and the Senate finally approves the Treaty of Versailles, but only because the U.S. was removed. So officially, our war with Germany does not end until 1921, and only because the U.S. was pulled as a member from the League of Nations, which is such an odd thing considering the League of Nations exists because of Woodrow Wilson, right? It's like the bone they threw him. They're like, crap, now I got to go to these meetings, but at least he'll sign the Versailles Treaty. Well, now the U.S. isn't even part of this. So from the beginning, the League of Nations is going to have a problem. Not only does it not have any teeth or enforcement, but the guy who believes in it the most can't even be a part of it, right? So not only does it have no teeth, but it has no heart. It has no soul. And again, just another sort of cartoon from the time, the concern that, as eventually, as we'll see here, as Japan enters into China and begins a horrendous war there. World War II technically starts in Asia with Japan's entrance into China. The League of Nations, with no real teeth and no soul, can't do anything but look and complain. And it does the same thing when the Italians invade Ethiopia. It does the same thing when the Germans invade Czechoslovakia. The League of Nations can't do anything about it. So we conclude World War I with some points. We're obviously preparing for World War II. And the reason I do spend so much time on the end of World War I is because I really want us to appreciate this debate over what lessons we're supposed to learn. Everybody rushes into World War I, so we learn, okay, slow down, calm down, think. But then we pause too much in World War II, right? The reason too I try to spend a little bit of time on the emotional aspect for Americans as guys came home or came home in boxes is to try and understand why it took Americans so long to get involved in World War II. Because as the Blitz was occurring, in 1940, as Germans were flying over London here at the start of World War I in Europe, killing thousands of civilians, causing permanent damage to England, we weren't there. And as British boys, took to the air in the Battle of Britain, and by a thread saved their country in some of the most, heroic action, I think, in modern history, we weren't there. And we're reminded of that. Like, yes, you were there on D-Day, and yes, you were there in the Bulge, but you weren't there for the Blitz, and you weren't there for the Battle of Britain. And there's an emotional, that's emotional for those people. I mean, you can walk around London today and still see damage caused by the German bombing campaign. So we desperately want to understand how we didn't recognize the Nazi threat. So we are preparing ourselves for World War II and why and how we respond that way. We're also introducing a new theme in American history that's now known as Wilsonianism. Wilsonianism is this idea based on the Romanticism of Woodrow Wilson that the U.S. does have a responsibility around the world. Because we have the ability to do so, we should so. Right? We should, as Woodrow Wilson would argue, make the world safe for democracy. So when we talk about this debate of what are global responsibilities for the U.S., Wilsonianism, the theory behind it, prominently argues that we have a responsibility to assist in the world. And he does win, he is sort of recognized, and I think even wins a Nobel Prize for these sort of ideals, at least. The problem with Wilsonianism, though, as we'll continue to see, is our attempt to save the world has become, in some cases, our greatest glory. Wonderful things we'll do. We will be there on the beaches of D-Day, and we should have been there to help arguably save the world. But in that same attempt, this has also been our great tragedy. As we attempt to save the world, we find ourselves in places where maybe we don't need to be. So it's kind of like the Spider-Man debate, right? With great power comes great responsibility, and with that comes, glory and tragedy. What we can also conclude about World War I is the progressive movement is officially over. With so many major corporations receiving contracts from the federal government, and because we were so focused on the war effort, although the average worker did do well during the war, a lot of these major corporations were allowed to ignore unions if they needed. They were exempt from antitrust laws. So we start to see a relaxing of those constraining laws that were put in place during the Progressive era. For the purposes of winning the war. Because we're also entering into a very anti-immigrant period, we kind of see the social reformers that we might connect more to, like Jane Addams and the Whole House, that's kind of dying as well. And so the Progressive era, this idea of helping these people who are struggling in the Gilded Age, that kind of comes to an end. And part of the reason it does is because Republicans here at the end of World War I just sort of felt that people leaning to the left, these progressives, had gone too far, right? Suggesting that we save the world. Well, look how that turned out. I always compare the end of the progressive movement to the end of the 1960s, because in, the progressive era attempted to do really good things, like fix issues with child labor and, have protections for workers so we don't have things like the Triangle Shirtwaist Tragedy fire, It attempted to do really good things, but people that were either leaning maybe too far to the left or people that maybe took us into wars we didn't want to go in, they gave the progressives a bad name. And so as we move into the 1920s, we see a new political party take over that doesn't want to be as hands-on, doesn't want to support civil rights for the sake of civil liberties anymore. And I compare it to the 1960s because during the 1950s and 60s, we have a series of reforms. There's, of course, the civil rights movement, but there's also the women's lib movement. There was a Chicano movement. There was a Native American movement. And these people were doing really good things, really, wonderful progressive things for Americans. But then the frickin' hippies took over. And you had, the famous Summer of Love in 1969 and the Manson killings and Woodstock and people running around naked and getting high and having sex. And then, and for some people, it was just too much. It was like the world had gone crazy. And so you see people retreating, and we get into, people on the right were able to point to people like these hippies and say, this is what the left is. This is what these civil rights people are. And it helped to actually deflate the civil rights movement and the progressive movements of the 1960s and take us into a more conservative, hands-off era of the late 70s and 1980s. All right, that concludes World War I.